My name is Joanne Whitmore. I'm 69 years old, retired architect, widowed for nearly a decade now. My husband Thomas and I designed and built this estate together. Every window, every garden wall, every custom tile in the foyer. It was our dream, and even after he passed, I stayed here, maintained it, protected it, loved it. So imagine the feeling, standing on the patio of your own home, only to be told you're no longer welcome. It was 1 week before the wedding. The estate was buzzing with florists, decorators, planners, all preparing for the big day. My son, Mason, was getting married, right here. On the grounds of the $4.2 million estate I still legally owned. I stood there with a tray of lemonade. Something I always used to do when Mason was little and played outside with his friends. Old habits don't fade. But as I approached the group, one of the young staffers, barely 20 if that, looked at me with hesitation. Ma'am? The bride said this is a family-only wedding. Maybe it's best if you don't hang around too much. My heart didn't break. It cracked slowly, the kind of crack you don't feel at once, but you know it'll echo later when no one's around. I looked at her. She couldn't meet my eyes. Then I turned to Mason, my only son, who was standing by the rose trellis, adjusting his cufflinks. He saw me. He saw everything. But instead of stepping forward, instead of speaking up for me, he looked away. And then Angela, the bride-to-be, walked over in her sleek designer outfit, holding a clipboard like she owned the place. She didn't greet me. She simply smirked and said, "The greatest gift you could give us would be to disappear during the wedding. Just a week." Surely that's not too much to ask. The air tightened around me. The sun, so warm a second ago, suddenly felt like a spotlight I hadn't asked for. Angela's eyes scanned the estate, the grand staircase, the lake view behind us, and then landed back on me with something close to calculation. I looked at her, calm, controlled. I've learned that silence can often speak louder than shouting. Then I said quietly, "You know this house? The one you're using for the venue? It's still legally mine." Just so you know, she froze, just for a beat, then flashed a smile like it was all a game. I didn't say anything more. I simply turned, walked back into the house, past the antique oak furniture I polished every weekend, past the photos that had mysteriously been removed from the hallway. Photos of me and Thomas, of Mason when he still called me Mama. In my room, I closed the door gently, sat at the edge of the bed, and I knew. This wasn't about just a wedding. This was the beginning of something I had been avoiding. A truth too painful to look at. Until now. My son had chosen her, and not just in marriage, but over me, over his past, over the hands that once held him when he was sick, scared, or just needed comfort. I didn't cry. Not then. Grief would come later, but what rose in me first was clarity. They didn't want me around? Fine. I'd give them exactly what they asked for, but I wouldn't leave in shame. No, if I disappeared, I would do so on my own terms. And when they returned from their honeymoon, it wouldn't be to this estate. Because I had just made a quiet phone call, one that would change everything. I wasn't always alone in that big estate. Years ago, it was a home built on hope and quiet joys. Richard and I had bought the land when it was just a sprawling patch of weeds and soil. We were both in our early 40s then, and while others our age sought sleek condos or homes closer to town, we wanted space. Space for roses, for oak trees, for long Sunday mornings on a porch we hadn't even built yet. Richard was a lawyer, sharp as a tack, but more importantly, he had vision. I was the one with the sketches and garden catalogs, but he was the one who mapped out the irrigation system and tilled the first furrows himself. "We're not building a house," he said one night, as we sat on folding chairs amid drywall dust. "We're planting a future." And we did. One rose bush at a time. The climbing Joseph's coat roses near the front porch. We planted those the year Mason was born. Richard said their warm hues reminded him of holding his newborn son in the morning light. By the time Mason turned 12, their vines had crawled across the trellis and kissed the roofline. There were cherry trees, too. Richard wanted them for the birds. I wanted them for the pies. Mason just loved climbing them. I still remember his laughter as he swung from the lower branches, boots scuffed and shirt untucked. He had his father's eyes, and when he smiled, it was like seeing both our lives reflected back. After Richard died, pancreatic cancer, swift and brutal, everything grew quieter. But the roses still bloomed, the trees still bore fruit, and I, with aching joints and an empty bed, found solace in the routine, pruning, mulching, planting tulip bulbs. Mason visited often at first. He helped me repaint the shutters once, in a shade of navy Richard had loved. He brought over soup when I caught the flu, showed me pictures from his job at the architecture firm, hugged me longer than usual on his dad's birthdays. He even talked about one day restoring the old barn on the back of the property into a guest house. But then Angela came into the picture. I remember the first time Mason brought her home. She had the kind of beauty you see on magazine covers. Elegant, poised, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She complimented the house, though she barely looked at it, said the roses were quaint. Over dinner, she steered conversations toward travel and designer labels, her fingers always hovering around her wine glass, but rarely sipping. When I asked about her family, she offered tight answers. When I shared stories about Richard, she glanced at Mason as if to say, "Is she always like this?" Still, I tried. I really did. I even offered to share some family recipes, hoping we could bond over cooking. She politely declined, said she was more into clean eating and had a private chef she preferred. Mason changed in small ways at first. He stopped helping in the garden, started taking calls during our dinners, visited less. Then came bigger changes, talking about modernizing the estate, suggesting I downsize, and maybe travel more. "You've done so much, Mom," he said once. "Maybe it's time you enjoyed life. Let the younger generation take care of things." I knew whose words those were. They weren't his, but I said nothing. Not yet. Because part of me hoped it was just a phase, that the Mason I raised, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the fields and write me Mother's Day poems, would come back. He never did. Instead, I became a guest in my own home, a soft presence in the background of their plans. When they announced the wedding, they were all smiles and Pinterest boards. Angela gushed about having it in the estate, as if it were some luxury venue she'd scouted, not the home where my husband and I had poured decades of love. They didn't ask. They assumed. And I, still nursing the wound of quiet rejection, said nothing. But the silence was growing heavy, and somewhere beneath it, something else began to stir. Not bitterness, but resolve. The first time Angela visited the estate, she wore a soft pink cardigan and brought me a tin of lemon shortbread cookies. She smiled sweetly, complimented the roses, and called me Mrs. Holloway, even though I asked her to just call me Joanne. There was something overly polished about her, like her kindness was memorized, not felt. She said all the right things. "You have such a beautiful home." It must be a dream, waking up to that view. "You must be proud of all this." I remember noticing how her eyes scanned the walls, the staircase, the window panes, not with warmth, but calculation. She didn't ask about my late husband, Richard. She didn't ask how long I'd lived there. She asked about the land size, about the neighborhood, about the recent sale price of the house down the road. I brushed it off. Maybe she was just curious. But then, Mason started pulling away. At first, it was subtle, skipping our Sunday dinners, replying to my texts with one-word answers, avoiding phone calls. I thought he was just overwhelmed with wedding planning. But soon, his tone changed. "Angela says she feels tense when she's here, Mom," he told me one afternoon, eyes flicking away. "Like you're judging her." I was stunned. I welcomed her. I baked for her. I've tried. "She says you hover," Mason cut in. "And you ask invasive questions." That hurt more than I expected. I didn't recall asking anything inappropriate, but I began second-guessing myself. Was I too present? Too eager to be involved? Then came the papers. It was 2 months before their wedding when Mason stopped by unexpectedly. He stood at the kitchen island, a manila envelope in his hands. "Hey, Mom, I need you to sign a couple of things. It's just temporary, wedding stuff, venue insurance forms. We need to show proof of ownership for the estate since the wedding's on the property." Angela's lawyer suggested it. I hesitated. "Venue insurance?" "Yeah," he said quickly, too quickly. "Don't worry, it's all standard. Just legal jargon. It's just easier if it's in Angela's name temporarily. We'll switch it back right after." The moment he said that, my gut stirred. Richard and I had built our life around this home, brick by brick, tree by tree. My name was on every deed, every receipt, every bill. Why would I transfer anything, even temporarily, into someone else's hands? Still, Mason looked tired, pressured, and I wanted peace. "I don't know, honey," I said softly, eyeing the stack of documents. He gave me a thin smile. "It's just paperwork, Mom." Don't overthink it. I didn't want to be the difficult mother, the controlling widow, the obstacle to his future. So I signed. And with the ink of my signature, something shifted in the house. Angela stopped pretending. She began giving instructions to the gardener, without asking me. She moved furniture. She ordered a new dining table without consulting me. "We need it for the rehearsal dinner," she said briskly when I pointed it out. I noticed her car in the driveway more than my son's. Her perfume lingered in the hallway, and one morning, the gate code stopped working, the same code I'd used for 10 years. I stood outside the gate with 2 bags of groceries, stunned. I called Mason. "Did you change the code?" Silence. Then, "Angela thought we needed more security. She had the system updated, and no one thought to tell me?" "Don't make this a thing, Mom," he sighed. "It's not about you." But it was. It was about the slow, deliberate erasure of me from my own home. The real blow came when I found out from the gardener that Angela had begun referring to the estate as their wedding gift. She told the caterers the estate was her fiancé's inheritance. He said, confused. She said it'll be theirs officially after the wedding. I stood frozen, hose still in hand, water spilling onto the petunias. I had signed something I didn't understand. I had trusted my son. And I was beginning to feel like a guest in the very home where I had buried Richard's ashes beneath the willow tree. The betrayal didn't come as a scream. It came in ripples, subtle acts, locked doors, dismissive glances, decisions made without me. It wasn't just about the house. It was about my place in Mason's life. Slowly, meticulously, replaced. Still, I didn't explode. I didn't argue. I didn't even cry. Not yet. I just started reading every document I could find. And one evening, I sat in Richard's old study, the place where we used to drink wine and argue about politics, and pulled out the folder with my original title, Deed, now wrinkled and yellowed. I opened it, and with trembling fingers, I compared it to what I had signed weeks ago. Then I knew. They weren't just planning a wedding on my estate. They were planning a life without me in it. I remember that night not because of the roast duck or the wine they served. I never got to taste either. I remember it because I realized for the first time what being erased from your own home truly felt like. It was 3 days before the wedding. The estate was glowing with lanterns strung across the trees Richard and I had planted with our bare hands. Our backyard, once the place where Mason played tag with our golden retriever, now had rows of white folding chairs and manicured rose arches that smelled like betrayal. Angela's family had flown in from Atlanta. They looked like the kind of people who judged napkin folds and wine pairings. Angela told me they were having a private, pre-wedding welcome dinner and suggested I take the night off. I blinked. "You're hosting it here, Angela." At my home, she gave me that tight-lipped smile I'd come to know. "I know, Joanne, and I'm so grateful. But this is more about our families blending, you know? You've already done so much." I stood at the bottom of the stairs in my navy cardigan and flats, still holding the serving dish I'd brought down. Angela floated past in a beaded gown, whispered something to Mason, and he turned to me with eyes colder than any December wind. "Mom," he said, avoiding my gaze, "maybe it's best if you don't come down tonight." Angela's families had a long flight, and, well, you tend to be a bit intense. It might make them uncomfortable. "Intense?" I repeated. He sighed. "Emotionally unstable sometimes. You know how you can be." My hands were trembling, but I kept the dish steady. I couldn't even find the words to argue. Instead, I turned and walked out the side door into the garden, still holding that casserole. That's how I ended up eating dinner alone on a bench under the oak tree. I watched through the windows as they laughed, toasted champagne, clinked glasses over the table Richard and I had bought from a small craftsman in Vermont. Angela saw me once. She was standing in the French doors holding her glass, and when her eyes met mine, she didn't flinch. She smiled, not warmly. "No," she smirked, and then turned back inside. I took small bites of the green bean almondine I'd made from scratch. It tasted like nothing, just warmth and salt and shame. Later that night, I went back inside through the kitchen door. The guests had left. The place was spotless, too spotless. My room had been moved. My things were shoved into the back guest suite, the one with the weak heating vent and the flickering light. My name wasn't on the place card for the ceremony anymore. I wasn't even listed as mother of the groom. I'd become a non-person in the very house I helped build. But as I stood there, numb and hollow, something nudged at me. A thought. No, a memory. Richard. He always kept a binder hidden, even from me, tucked deep behind the books in the library. Not secrets, just documents, blueprints, old property deeds, estate plans. His just-in-case binder. I tiptoed upstairs, heart pounding like I was a teenager sneaking out. I went straight to the mahogany shelf, reached behind the dusty volumes on European property law, and there it was, a black leather binder with his handwriting on the label. For Joanne, only if necessary. I sat on the floor and opened it. Inside were copies of the house deed, records of the trust, notes from a lawyer named Albert Morgan, and a typed letter addressed to me. The letter was dated 8 months before Richard died. It read, "Joe, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. Maybe with Mason. Maybe with someone trying to manipulate you. You need to know. The estate is fully yours. I never put Mason's name on the title, even if he told you otherwise. Angela gives me the wrong feeling. I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm not, don't let them take this from you. Use the trust structure. Call Morgan. And remember who built this home. Richard." My breath caught. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I wasn't just a relic of the past. I was the owner. And now I had a choice. Would I keep sitting in the garden, eating alone while they dined in the house I helped build? Or would I reclaim what was already mine? I sat there a while longer, listening to the quiet hum of the house, Richard's words echoing in my chest like an ember reigniting. No more benches, no more crumbs. I closed the binder, stood up, and turned off the lights behind me. The wedding may have still been days away, but my decision had already been made. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed and the only sounds were the rustling of the garden hedges and the distant chime of wind through the old oak by the porch, I sat alone at the edge of my bed. On my lap lay the leather folder I had found in the back of Richard's old desk drawer. My hands trembled slightly as I undid the strap and opened it. There, on top, was the deed to the estate. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen this document in years, but the moment I read the wording, my heart began to race, not with fear, but with a strange and quiet surge of clarity. The estate, the house, the garden, the orchard, every stone of the patio Mason and I laid by hand one summer when he was 12, it was still in my name. And not just that. Richard had written in a clause, quietly tucked into the body of the deed, stating that any transfer or sale of the property required a notarized signature from me, separate from any marriage or familial representation. In short, Angela couldn't touch it, Mason couldn't sign it away, and no wedding planner or event coordinator had any legal right to commit to it unless I said so, officially and on paper. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but I didn't cry. Behind the deed was a folded letter, handwritten in Richard's neat lawyerly script. The envelope read only, "For Joe, if things ever feel unclear." I opened it. "My Joe, if you're reading this, it means something has happened. Something I feared but never dared speak aloud. I know your heart. I know how deeply you love, how fiercely you protect, and how much you forgive, sometimes to your own detriment. That's why I put protections in place. If anyone ever tries to manipulate you or take what we built, remember this. You own this place, not just legally, but spiritually. This house breathes with your laughter. Don't let anyone turn it into something cold. Call Robert Hayes. He'll know what to do." My fingers pressed against the name. Robert Hayes. Of course. Richard's old partner at the firm. They'd started their practice together in their early 30s and remained close long after Richard retired. I hadn't spoken to Robert in years, but the thought of hearing his voice suddenly gave me courage I didn't realize I needed. I picked up the phone, dialed the office number printed at the top of the letterhead, half expecting it to go to voicemail. Instead, I heard a familiar voice. "Hayes and Bloomlaw," he said, his voice older but unmistakable. "This is Robert." "Robert," I said softly. "It's Joanne." A pause. Then, Joanne Hale? Is that really you?" "Yes," I replied, my voice cracking just slightly. There was warmth in his tone immediately. "Good heavens, it's been a while. How are you? How's Mason? And that's why I'm calling," I interrupted, steadying myself. "I found a letter. From Richard. And I have the deed. Something's not right. I think I've been tricked." His tone shifted instantly. "Do you have the original deed in front of you?" "I do." "Good. Read me the clause. Subsection D, under transferability." I did. Slowly, clearly. After a long pause, Robert let out a low breath. "Joanne, this property is airtight. Richard made sure of it. You're still the sole legal owner, and without a notarized signature, witnessed and independently verified, no one can touch a single square inch of that land. Whatever they've been planning, it's not enforceable." Relief hit me like a quiet wave, but so did something else. Resolve. "Will you help me?" I asked. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "And Joe, Richard was a brilliant man. But you're the heart of that place. Don't ever forget it." As I hung up the phone, I sat for a long time in the quiet. I could hear Angela's voice from earlier that evening, echoing in my mind. The way she'd laughed at the table, sipping wine with her manicured fingers draped over the glass, talking about floral arrangements and custom string quartets, as if this estate were just some venue on loan. But now I knew something they didn't. They thought I was weak, sentimental, disposable. But I had the deed. I had the law. And most of all, I had the truth. And I was done being silent. The morning after I met with Richard's old attorney, something inside me shifted. I didn't feel scared anymore. I felt still, like a lake before sunrise. That stillness wasn't numbness. It was clarity. Years of loving quietly had taught me how to observe. Now, I would apply that same quiet patience, but with purpose. I began by photocopying every legal document in the folder Richard had left. I took them to the local UPS store and made 3 certified copies. One I left in a safe deposit box at the bank. One I handed to Mr. Fenwick, the lawyer. The last I hid under a loose floorboard in my old sewing room. Beneath faded fabric scraps and rusted bobbins no one would think to look through. Next, I changed the login credentials to the home's smart system. Richard had upgraded everything years ago. Doors, lights, climate control, cameras. It had always been a source of pride for him. "Joe," he used to grin, "if I croak before you, at least the house will keep you company." I smiled bitterly as I watched the app screen update with new security codes. From now on, I would know exactly who came in and out of the house. Angela had insisted on hosting the wedding reception here. "It's so charming, like a vintage Pinterest board," she chirped on a call with the planner. The irony of praising the place while plotting to take it never escaped me. I'd stayed silent then, but now, silence became strategy. I made a quiet appointment with Gregorio, the groundskeeper who had tended to the roses for over a decade. He used to bring his granddaughter sometimes, and I'd let her pick strawberries near the back fence. There was still trust between us, more than I had with my own son. We sat on the wooden bench under the arbor Richard built. "Gregorio," I said gently, "do me a favor. On the day of the wedding, I want everything to stop. Sprinklers, lights, catering access. Nothing should function unless I say so. Quietly. No announcement. Just off." He looked at me, surprised, but didn't ask questions. "Si, Senora Joanne. I'll make it." So that was all I needed. One loyal witness. Angela, of course, remained in her performance mode. She emailed me a list of acceptable wardrobe options for the wedding, suggesting I stay away from bold colors. I didn't respond. Mason barely spoke to me unless it was to confirm some logistical detail. He acted like I was a tenant overstaying my welcome. I started to wonder if he even realized what he was doing anymore, or if Angela had made him believe that all this was normal. But I wasn't focused on their behavior now. I had entered another state entirely, like I was watching a play from backstage, already knowing the ending. I prepared everything down to the hour. I notified the bank to flag any attempts to refinance or transfer the deed. I added alerts to my email for any legal filings related to the property. I even hired a photographer, not for the wedding, but to discreetly document the house and grounds before the event, in case Angela tried to sue for damages later. On the surface, I smiled. I nodded at meetings. I offered tea. But inside, I was building a chessboard. Every move calibrated. Every step one breath away from checkmate. 3 nights before the wedding, I stood alone in the backyard, just before midnight. The moonlight glazed over the stone path Richard and I laid by hand. I could almost hear his voice again. "They think they're smarter." That's always their mistake. I held his letter in my hand, creased from how many times I'd unfolded it. He hadn't left me instructions. He'd left me a map. Not just to protect the house, but to remember who I was. Not a doormat, not a burden, but the woman he chose, who built a home with him from nothing. The house didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like armor. I walked back inside, past the bouquet of white lilies Angela had ordered for the front foyer. Flowers she claimed symbolized purity and new beginnings. She had no idea how prophetic that choice would be, because in just a few days, there would be a new beginning. But not for her. The kitchen had always been my domain. For over 3 decades, it was where I brewed comfort into stews and simmered silence into Sunday roasts. That morning, the house was abuzz. Planners walking in and out, ribbons measured, wine bottles lined up on marble counters like obedient soldiers. But in that moment, I stood in front of the chopping board, snipping fresh thyme from the planter by the window. My hands moved slowly, calmly, precisely. The scent of rosemary and onion filled the air. I heard her before I saw her, heels clicking like impatience echoing through the tiles. Angela, the bride-to-be. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. "Oh," she said in that tight, falsely sweet voice of hers. "Didn't expect to see you here this morning." I stirred the broth with a wooden ladle. "I live here," I said plainly. "Where else would I be?" She gave a clipped little laugh, but there was nothing humorous about it. "Well, you know," she said, stepping farther into the kitchen. "I just figured you'd want to stay out of the way this week. It's a busy time. A lot of important things happening." I turned and looked at her then. Her nails were perfectly polished, her ivory dress cinched just so around her waist. She looked like something out of a bridal magazine, immaculate and poised, the picture of grace. But her eyes held something sharp, like the edge of a knife hiding in lace. "Don't you have somewhere else to be, Joanne?" she added, smiling too wide, like it was a joke. I dried my hands on the towel, picked up a bundle of parsley, and began chopping slowly, deliberately. "This," I said softly, not raising my voice, "is still my kitchen, dear." For a flicker of a second, the smile on her face twitched, just slightly. Her fingers curled at her side, and I could see the small gasp she tried to suppress. Angela was used to being in control. She wasn't used to people meeting her edge with silence. "You know," she said, pulling herself together, "with all the things going on this week, maybe it'd be better if the staff handled meals. It's easier on everyone." I looked up from the parsley. "The staff," I echoed. She nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. I just mean, you don't have to concern yourself with all this. We've got everything handled." "That's kind of you to say." I smiled faintly and set down the knife. But I wasn't making dinner for anyone else. Just me. Her mouth parted slightly, as if she wasn't expecting that. I walked to the pot, gave it one final stir, then turned off the stove. "Smells like something old-fashioned," she murmured behind me. "My mom always says garlic is too heavy for wedding week." I turned slowly and looked her in the eye. Not with malice, not with anger, but with something steadier than both. "Your mother's not cooking here," I said, "and I use garlic in everything I love." The words hung in the air like steam rising from the pot. She straightened, cleared her throat. "Well, I suppose I'll leave you to it then." She made a turn and walked out, faster than she came in. But I knew better. She'd be back. Maybe not into the kitchen, but into whatever room she thought she could claim next. That night, I ate alone. At the far end of the long dining table, I had polished every Thanksgiving since Mason was a toddler. Angela and Mason had gone out to dinner with the wedding planner. I sat with my bowl of soup and a slice of sourdough, listening to the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway tick its slow, defiant rhythm. In that moment, I realized something. She wasn't just marrying my son. She was trying to inherit a life. But a home isn't just bricks and square footage. It holds memory in the floors, dignity in the kitchen walls, and stories in the garden beds. And I had lived every line of it. The next morning, I saw the arrangements being changed. The florals were no longer roses from the estate grounds. She'd ordered orchids from Miami. She had the gardener move my heirloom benches from the ceremony area to make space for a modern photo. Booth control. 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 Let her think she had it. Let her think she was winning, because I already knew something she didn't. That recipe she couldn't quite recognize in the kitchen yesterday, it wasn't just dinner, it was a beginning. The air that morning was oddly still. I had just finished arranging fresh gardenias in the foyer, my late husband Richard's favorite flower. He used to say the scent made the whole house feel like home. I took a step back, admiring the quiet elegance of it. It was the kind of small touch he would have appreciated. I didn't hear Mason come in. He stood behind me, stiff and awkward. He had his hands in his pockets, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, just like he used to do when he broke something as a boy and didn't know how to confess. "Mom," he said. I turned slowly. "Yes?" He cleared his throat. "Angela and I were talking." I nodded but said nothing. I already felt the pit in my stomach widen. Mothers know. We always know. And we think, he continued, not meeting my eyes, maybe it'd be best if you stayed somewhere else this weekend, just to avoid any tension. There it was. I looked at him, really looked. The son I had raised. The boy who used to fall asleep on my lap after story time, who used to bring me dandelions in spring and ask me to make a wish. Now standing in front of me, asking me to disappear from my own home like some inconvenient ghost. I took a slow breath, let it settle. My hands, still holding the garden scissors, didn't tremble. I see, I finally said, my voice calm. It's not personal, he rushed to add, sensing the gravity of what he'd just said. She wants everything to go smoothly. You understand, right? Of course, I said. His shoulders dropped slightly, relieved that I hadn't made a scene, that I was, as always, the agreeable mother. But then I turned to face him fully and walked forward, closing the space between us. I looked him in the eye, steady and unblinking. But Mason, I said quietly, if I leave, the house leaves too. He blinked. What? I placed the scissors down gently on the entry table, then crossed my arms, not in anger, but in finality. If I'm not welcome here this weekend, neither is the venue. You'll need to inform your 200 guests that they'll need to bring tents. Wait, Mom, what are you talking about? I offered him a small smile. Not warm, not cruel, just real. This house, I said softly, still belongs to me. Legally. Every inch of it. And I've already instructed the gardener, the caterers, and the valet company to stand down. Quietly, he stared at me, dumbfounded. You can't do that. We already paid. No, I cut in gently. You didn't. I did. And the contracts are still in my name. He opened his mouth to protest again, but there was nothing he could say. Because for once, I wasn't pleading. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't folding myself smaller just to keep peace. I was simply standing. Mason, I added after a long pause. Do you remember when you were 7 and tried to build that soapbox car in the garage? He blinked, confused. You gave up when it got hard. Screamed. Kicked it. Said it wasn't worth it. But your father and I sat with you for hours, helping you understand the bolts, the weight, the angles. We didn't let you quit on something that mattered, because we knew one day life would test you harder than a wooden car on wheels. He didn't speak. Well, I said softly, this is one of those tests. His mouth tightened. Angela's going to be furious. I tilted my head slightly. She already is. He looked away. There was a long silence. Then quieter. You're really going to ruin my wedding over this? I let out the softest breath. I didn't ruin anything. I simply declined being erased. For the first time, his bravado faltered. He walked past me toward the door, paused, then said, You've changed. No, I replied gently. I've just stopped apologizing for existing. He left without another word. I stood alone in the quiet house, the morning sun spilling golden light across the entryway floor. Outside, the gardenias remained still. Inside, I had never felt more present. The house was unusually quiet that evening, wrapped in that kind of heavy silence that falls before a storm. I waited until I was sure they were all asleep. Angela with her glowing face masks and bedtime affirmations. Mason most likely on the balcony, checking guest lists and drink orders. Then I slipped on my cardigan and stepped out. The gravel path crunched softly under my shoes as I made my way to the rose garden. It had been years since I truly walked through it. Not just to glance or water, but to see. The white roses were still blooming, not as proud as they once were, but still alive, still reaching. I knelt beside the old stone bench, ran my fingers through the petals. "Richard," I whispered. This was his place. Not just the garden, but all of it. Every arch, every hidden pond, every stained glass window. He had built this home not as a monument to wealth, but as a cradle for family. And these white roses, he planted them the day Mason was born. "One day, this place will be yours," he told our newborn son, cradled in his arms, standing right here under the stars. I could still hear his voice, calm, assured, and so proud. But what neither of us had known was that Mason would grow up and hand over the keys of his heart to a woman who saw homes as assets, who called my garden shabby landscaping and asked if we could pave over it for a cocktail tent. I pulled a few weeds gently from around the rose base. The soil was still soft, still breathing. I pressed my palm to the ground. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but something steadier held me. A knowing, a quiet strength that had settled into my bones like the roots of those very roses. This house wasn't Angela's stage. It wasn't Mason's PR prop. It was our family's legacy, and I was still here to guard it. Back in the house, I had already packed a small overnight bag, just enough for one night. My toothbrush, my scarf, a thermos of tea. No drama, no confrontation. Let them believe I'd stepped aside. I didn't go far. Just down the curved driveway, past the gate, to where the old tree shaded the entrance path. I parked my car there and reclined the seat. Rolled the window halfway. It was chilly, but bearable. I sipped my tea, listening to the distant murmur of final wedding preparations. A rental van beeped as it backed up. Some servers joked loudly near the tent. And still, not one person realized I had left. No one noticed the lights off in my bedroom, or the absence of my steps in the hallway. In a way, I felt invisible, but also free. From this distance, the house looked like something from a postcard. Glowing under string lights, trimmed hedges perfectly lined, the windows polished to sparkle like stars. They had polished every surface, but not the soul of the place. That still lived in memories, ones they couldn't understand or erase. I thought about Mason as a child, how he used to follow Richard into the garden with a plastic shovel, begging to help. How he'd once planted a single red rose among the whites and proudly declared, "This one's for Mama." He was 6. Now he wanted me gone, for the weekend. Just to avoid tension, he said. "No, son. What you wanted was a clean slate. A wedding unblemished by the presence of a mother who still remembered who you used to be." I curled up in the seat and pulled the scarf tighter around me. The moonlight danced on the windshield. I closed my eyes and let the night hold me. I wasn't angry anymore, just watchful, like the roses, still rooted. In the morning, they would wake to a house missing more than just a mother, because they had misjudged the quiet ones. We don't raise our voices, we raise our roots. And mine ran deeper than they'd ever know. I woke up with the early sun warming the windshield of my car. My back ached slightly from the reclined position, but there was something peaceful about watching the morning dew collect on the rose bushes just beyond the gate. I stretched, smoothed out my coat, and stepped out. The air was crisp, clean, still. For a moment, it was just me and the birdsong in the garden Richard once cherished. I picked up the old metal watering can I'd brought with me, and walked slowly toward the hedge of white roses. They were in full bloom today, stubborn, elegant, and entirely out of place in the storm that was about to hit. By 7 a.m., I heard the first car honk, then another, then 3 more. From behind the iron gates, a caravan of vans and catering trucks had lined up, tail to tail. Some carried lighting rigs. Others had marquees strapped to the roofs. A group of servers stood outside their vehicle, checking watches, looking confused. I could hear murmurs, snippets of frustration. Did we get the wrong address? No, it says McIntyre Estate. Why aren't the gates opening? I knew why. 2 days ago, I had changed every code and revoked every temporary contractor access tag. Not a soul could get in unless I allowed it. One man, wearing a crisp white shirt and a headset, jumped out of a black SUV and marched toward the gate. I watched him fumble with his phone. Then he made a call. I could only hear one side of it. Ma'am? Yes. This is Logan, the event coordinator. We're here as scheduled, but, well, the gate's locked. No one's answering. We tried calling your planner, but she's not picking up either. I could imagine the panic on the other end of the line. Within 10 minutes, Angela came storming down the long gravel path, heels clicking, veil of entitlement wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She saw me. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. Just kept watering the roses. Slow, deliberate. She raised her voice slightly. Joanne? I turned, smiled faintly. Good morning, I said. Beautiful day, isn't it? She blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off by my calm. There's a problem with the gate. None of the vendors can get in. I glanced toward the security box mounted beside the pillar. That's odd. Angela stepped closer. Could you open it? I paused, gently placing the watering can down on the gravel. Angela, I said, I believe we had a conversation yesterday, didn't we? She looked confused. About what? About family, about who this weekend was for a muscle in her cheek twitched. Look, I know tensions are high, but can we not make a scene? Oh, sweetheart, I said, brushing a few stray petals from my sleeve. I'm not making a scene. I'm just making coffee next to my rose garden. From behind her, a young man with a clipboard jogged up, pale and sweating. Miss Carter, he said to Angela, we've got a situation. The power was cut to the outdoor lighting rig, and the tent crew says the lawn service canceled their access yesterday. Angela turned, beet red. What? That's impossible. He lowered his voice. Also, the catering team just received a cancellation notice. Signed by the property owner, Angela wheeled around to face me. You canceled the catering? I tilted my head. Did I? You did, she snapped. You're ruining everything. I kept my voice low and steady. Angela, if you and Mason want your own family celebration, you're absolutely entitled to it. But as you said so clearly, I shouldn't be here. I'm not the bride. I'm just the person who owns the venue. And the land. And the contracts tied to it. Angela looked as though she'd been slapped. Her lips parted, then closed again. A long silence settled over us. Behind her, a few of the vendors had begun packing their equipment back into trucks. The word had traveled fast. But what about Mason? She said softly, almost to herself. I bent down, pulled a single white rose from the bush, and handed it to her. You might want to go tell him, I said, before the guests arrive and start asking questions. Her fingers curled around the stem, uncertain. I walked past her, the the scent of damp earth and blooming roses trailing behind me. The gate, still locked, stood tall and unbothered by the chaos outside. By 9 a.m., most of the team had left. By 10 o'clock, only silence remained, and me, back in my garden, tending what was mine. The Monday after the chaos, I drove into town with a calm heart and an envelope in my purse. I parked across the street from the small law office Richard and I had visited every year since Mason was born. It was tucked between an old tailor shop and a florist, the same one that used to send us peonies every spring, signed, "From Your Secret Admirer," even though we all knew it was Richard being cheeky. Mr. Ellison was already waiting. He hadn't aged a day since Richard's funeral, except maybe the silver had crept closer to his temples. He greeted me with a soft, knowing smile. "I take it the weekend was eventful?" he said as he poured tea. I nodded. It was clarifying. Without another word, he opened his drawer and placed a thick file between us. "Your husband was a methodical man," he said. "This has been ready for over 2 decades. He slid the first page toward me. It was a trust agreement, dated 22 years ago. Richard's bold signature sat next to mine. I ran my finger down the lines I'd once skimmed in youthful confidence, not realizing their weight until now. Joanne Margot Fields, sole beneficiary of the Oakmere estate, including all land, contents, and rights of usage. Back then, we'd agreed we would update it after Mason got married. We wanted to wait until we saw the kind of man our son would become, the kind of partner he would choose. But after everything they said, after being told to disappear, I had no intention of changing a single word. I looked up. "I want a certified copy sent to the event manager, the rental company, the floral vendor, the catering team, and the wedding planner. Everyone who had their name on anything tied to this property." Mr. Ellison's brow lifted, but he nodded. "You're not disputing the wedding?" "No," I said. "I'm correcting the misunderstanding that I was no longer here." He opened a second file, one I'd forgotten existed. It was the updated usage contract Mason had submitted to rent the estate for the wedding. His name, Angela's name, and their signatures, right there on the dotted lines. But the box labeled property owner's approval, still blank. "I never signed this," I said. "So technically, it's invalid," Mr. Ellison finished for me. "And even if you had, the clause your husband added still stands." He tapped the fine print with his pen. "The estate may not be used in the absence of the legal owner. Any event held without the physical presence of the owner constitutes breach of agreement and will be considered trespassing." I remember laughing when Richard had insisted on that line. "Why would anyone plan an event in a house without the host?" I had asked. He'd winked and said, "Because one day they just might." And now here we were. And somehow, he'd known. I asked Mr. Ellison to send a copy of that clause along with the notices. No anger, no long letters, just facts, just signatures, just silence. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. By the time I left the office, the morning light was warming the pavement. I crossed the street slowly, letting each step ground me. Outside, my car's windshield reflected the branches of the dogwood tree above, the same kind we'd planted in the estate's back garden the day Mason turned 5. I thought of how many nights I'd stayed up with that boy, how many times I'd patched his scraped knees, how many letters I'd saved from camp when he said he missed me more than pizza. And now, this was where we were. I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled out my planner and wrote a single line across that Saturday. The day my silence became legally binding. I had no intention of canceling their wedding. That was never the goal. Let them marry. Let them laugh. Let them take pictures under the arbor. But let it be known, none of this was theirs. The land, the roses, the fountain, the oak trees that lined the gravel path. They all had a witness now. Me. I had stood beside Richard when this place was just dirt and vision. I had held his hand as he drew up the architectural plans by candlelight during those power outages. I had walked every inch of that estate after his funeral, whispering promises to keep it whole. Now, I was keeping them, and I did it without shouting, without slamming doors, without slapping ultimatums across the breakfast table, just with one piece of paper, one clause, one signature that had never been theirs. And for the first time in months, as I drove home along the winding road that led back to Oakmere, I felt peace, the kind that doesn't need to be announced, because some truths don't roar, they whisper through roses. And now, the house was listening. I was already in my usual place by the time they arrived, seated quietly on the old wooden bench beneath the white trellis my late husband had built. The morning sun was gentle, casting dappled light through the leaves. I was holding a cup of chamomile tea, the kind Richard used to brew on Sunday mornings. A single rose had fallen onto the gravel. I bent to pick it up, brushing off the dew. From the corner of my eye, I saw the side gate swing open. They must have assumed the garden was empty. Angela stepped in first, her phone in hand, barking quick instructions to someone on the other end. Her mother trailed behind, in a crisp beige dress and pearls, her eyes scanning the grounds with a kind of practiced superiority. I stayed still, letting the ivy and rose bushes shield me. "This is where we'll set the main bridal portraits," Angela said, gesturing broadly at the trellis, unaware I was just steps away. "We'll do a few with the flower girls here." And no, we're not including his mom. She gives off, thrift store energy. Her mother chuckled in agreement. "She's just going to age the whole look. Better she stays in the background, if she even shows up." My fingers tightened around the teacup handle. I inhaled slowly, letting the scent of roses ground me. Then, still seated, I spoke. "You might want to reconsider the lighting," I said evenly. "This part of the garden tends to be in shade by 3 p.m. Angela froze mid-step. Her mother turned so quickly her heels clicked against the stone. I stood up slowly, dusted my skirt, and walked into the light. Angela's eyes widened as she recognized me. The color drained from her face. "I didn't see you there," she stammered. "I noticed," I replied calmly. "But I did hear you." Every word Angela opened her mouth, then closed it. I took another step forward. Not aggressively, not threatening, just present. "You're a guest here, Angela," I said. "Let's not forget who the host is." Her mouth twitched. She glanced toward her mother, who was now studying me more closely, perhaps remembering the headline in the regional business paper, or maybe connecting the face to the last name on the deed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her, but I let each word land, like petals falling in absolute silence. "I built this garden," I continued, "or rather I protected it, for decades. You may decorate it for a day, but don't mistake that for ownership." Angela's mother leaned in and whispered something in her daughter's ear. Angela looked rattled. She didn't speak. Then, just like that, they turned. Without another word, they exited the gate they came through. Angela didn't even look back. I stood alone in the quiet that followed. The only sound was the slow trickle of the fountain Richard had installed during our 25th anniversary. I looked down at the rose in my hand again. White, full bloom, barely bruised. I smiled, and then I returned to the bench, took a sip of tea, watched the wind move through the branches overhead. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer an accessory in my own life. I was the gardener and the gatekeeper. The music started drifting in before noon, strings and flutes, laughter, two all, distant, as if the sounds were carried by a breeze that wasn't meant for me. But I knew what they were. Wedding music. On my land. On my late husband's soil. They still went ahead with it. Despite everything. Despite the silence I'd sent through legal channels. Despite the clause in the lease that clearly stated my presence was required. They chose to gamble on my silence, as if it meant defeat. I sat in my reading room with the windows open. The soft rustle of pages competed gently with the distant celebration. That room had been my sanctuary for years. Mahogany shelves lined with books Daniel and I collected. A fireplace filled with ash and memory. And the creak of my favorite armchair that had molded to my frame over decades. It was the only place in the entire estate that still felt untouched by what my son had done. There was no invitation for me, not even a courtesy call, not even a folded seat hidden in the back row. Nothing. Earlier that morning, the event team had been bustling outside my window, placing chairs under the oaks, stringing fairy lights, fluffing white linens on long tables. I saw the caterers unloading trays. Glassware gleamed like teeth in the sun. And I remained inside. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. Each peal of laughter from the lawn struck me like a distant slap. Each speech, faintly caught on the wind, was a reminder that I had been completely, intentionally, erased from the script, like I was a character in a novel whose pages had been torn out. But I did not cry. There was a time I might have, when I would have stood at the window wringing my hands, wondering what I'd done wrong, begging God or the universe or Daniel's ghost to tell me why. But not today. Instead, I pulled out the ledger, the old leather-bound one Daniel and I kept in the safe behind the painting. It was heavy, filled with neat lines and careful handwriting, his and mine, tracking every penny, every land parcel, every clause. On page 63, a note in Daniel's writing, revised August 2001. In event of my death, all holding rights remain solely with D. D. Me Dolores. I traced the ink with my fingertip, remembering his voice. He had written it after our son got married. After he said, "If anything happens, I want no ambiguity. You protect what we built, Dee, not them." Back then, I thought he was just being cautious. Now, I realized he'd seen something I hadn't. My eyes scanned further down the page. There, tucked behind a folded envelope, was the transfer form. The final deed that would move the vineyard and the remaining business holdings into the irrevocable trust. The trust only I could administer. I didn't hesitate. I signed. Outside, the cheers swelled. Someone was probably giving a toast. Maybe they were thanking my son and his new bride for bringing everyone together. Maybe they were praising the venue, my roses, my magnolia trees, my orchards, as if they had fallen from the sky just for them. Maybe, for a brief moment, someone would glance around and wonder why I wasn't there. And maybe my son would look away, pretending not to care. Or maybe he was too busy dancing under the canopy of my labor to even notice. That was okay. I wasn't going to ruin their day. That's not the kind of woman I am. I didn't show up with police or a public declaration. I didn't shout at the guests or cause a scene. That would have made me no different than the chaos they created. I didn't need to raise my voice, because the ink on that document, it was louder than any scream. I placed the signed deed back into the envelope, sealed it, and placed it gently into the outgoing tray on my desk. Monday morning, my attorney would file it, quietly, legally, irrevocably. By the time they finished their cake, the estate would be beyond their reach. I leaned back in the armchair and looked out the window. They could have had everything: love, family, history. But they chose pretense and exclusion. They wanted me gone from the picture. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. I erased myself, but I also erased them from what they thought they owned. Because if they could pretend I didn't exist, then surely they'd understand when I returned the favor. The morning after the wedding, I woke up early, earlier than usual. The sunlight filtered softly through the white curtains, casting long, warm shadows across the oak floors of my reading room. I had slept well. No nightmares, no tossing, just quiet. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and stepped out onto the porch. The garden, still damp from last night's light drizzle, looked especially radiant. My roses were beginning to open again, as if they too had endured something and decided to bloom anyway. I had barely taken my first sip when my phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, but something about the area code made me answer. "Hello, this is Joanne." A hesitant voice responded on the other end. "Mrs. Danvers?" "This is Talia from Everbright Events, the wedding planning team that organized yesterday's ceremony." Her voice was tense, cautious, almost afraid. I remained calm. "Yes?" There was a pause, too long to be a signal issue. Then she continued. We've received notification from the legal team that the estate owner has filed a formal objection regarding the event held on your property yesterday. Is that correct?" She already knew the answer. I let the silence sit just long enough before replying. "Yes, that's correct. I see," she stammered. "So, just for clarity, the estate's official owner is you?" "Yes. I inherited the property, the hotel chain, and the venue 5 years ago, when my husband passed. My daughter booked everything under her name, but never disclosed our relation, or that she'd been uninvited to the estate." Another pause. I could almost hear the clicking of a pen or the frantic scanning of documents in the background. I'm so sorry, ma'am. We had no idea." "That's not your fault," I said evenly. "You were misled." A few seconds passed. Then her voice lowered into something more serious. "Our legal department has advised us that hosting unauthorized events, especially when tied to fraudulent representations, violates several of our clauses. But more importantly, we're wondering how you'd like to proceed." I didn't speak immediately. I looked over the garden beds. The dew glistened on every petal. Peaceful, steady, rooted. "I won't be suing," I finally said. Talia exhaled, sharply. That's a relief. "But," I continued gently, "there will be a new clause added to all property contracts moving forward. One that explicitly prohibits both of them, and any business they attempt to represent, from ever booking with us again." "I understand," she said quietly. No press, no confrontation, no social media drama, just a quiet redirection of access, I added. They chose to remove me from the frame. I'm simply ensuring I stay out of theirs. From now on. There was another beat of silence. Then, respectfully, she replied, "Understood, ma'am. We'll update the files accordingly." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you, Talia." "Have a good morning." "You too, Mrs. Danvers," she said. And again, "We're truly sorry." I ended the call. No satisfaction, no gloating, just finality. I placed the phone gently down on the wooden table beside my tea. The steam still curled lazily into the morning air. Then I stood, walked toward the rose garden, and picked up the watering can. I poured slow streams of water over the soil, humming a little song from years ago. My husband used to whistle it when he trimmed the hedges. Every petal absorbed the moisture like it had been waiting for me. Like they knew. Behind me, the estate stretched silent and still. No more rented chairs, no more strings of fairy lights, no more laughter from those who'd forgotten the hands that once fed them. Only the roses remained. And me. I didn't need to tell anyone what had happened. The soil would remember. The walls had heard enough. Justice didn't always wear a robe or arrive with a gavel. Sometimes, it came through contract clauses and the quiet refusal to let yourself be used again. That morning, I didn't look back at the mansion. I didn't think about the wedding. I just focused on the garden. My garden. Because at some point, you stop asking why they did what they did, and you start asking what you'll grow from it. 3 days after the wedding, I heard the doorbell ring at precisely 9 a.m. I was folding linen napkins I had embroidered years ago, not for any guests, just because I liked the order it brought me. I walked to the door slowly. When I opened it, there they were, my son, his wife, and a tall man in a charcoal suit carrying a black leather briefcase. "Mom," my son began, his voice unusually measured. This is Mr. Danvers. He's our lawyer." I said nothing, only glanced at the woman beside him. Angela avoided my eyes. Her lipstick was smudged at the corner, and her pearl earrings didn't quite match. "We think there may have been a misunderstanding," my son continued, "about the ownership of the estate." I tilted my head. "Misunderstanding?" He cleared his throat. "The land, the venue, and the house. We'd like to clarify a few things." Legally, I nodded gently and stepped aside. "Come in." They followed me into the sunroom. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the roses outside seemed to hold their breath. I gestured toward the chairs around the oak table. They sat, except Angela, who remained standing, arms folded. Without a word, I turned to the corner armoire and reached inside. Out came a small black strongbox. I placed it on the table. My son's eyes flicked toward it. I opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside were neatly organized documents, some yellowed with time, others crisp and recent. I laid them out in careful order. "Here," I said, "my late husband's will. The original copy, notarized next. The land deed, transferred solely to me upon his passing another paper. Ownership papers for the entire estate, including the venue, catering kitchen, parking, the adjacent guest house, and the forest line. Another, 20 years of tax records filed in my name." The room grew colder, even though the sun was bright. The lawyer leaned in to inspect the documents. He reached for the deed, his brows furrowing deeper with every line he read. After a long silence, he finally looked up at them, at both of them, and spoke with a dry, subdued voice. "She's correct. Angela slammed her purse down on the floor. "You said she wouldn't actually go through with this," she hissed, turning to my son. "You said she was just bluffing, that she was too old to handle this kind of paperwork." He looked stunned, trapped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Angela whirled around to me. "You can't do this. You let us plan the wedding. You didn't say a word until it was too late. That's manipulative." I didn't respond. I simply reached into the box again and pulled out a smaller folder, unlabeled. I slid it across the table. They stared at it. "What's this?" my son asked cautiously. "A copy of the event cancellation notice sent to your wedding planner. Dated and signed 3 days before your ceremony, with my attorney's seal." The lawyer gave a slow, reluctant nod. "This holds up." Angela's lips parted in disbelief. "She's been playing us this whole time," she whispered. "I'm not playing anyone," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "I simply withdrew from a game I never agreed to play." She stood up so fast, the chair screeched against the hardwood. "This is insane. You think you're proving a point? You've just humiliated us." "No," I replied calmly. "I've protected what your father and I built for decades. That's not humiliation. That's responsibility." Angela grabbed her bag and stormed out. My son stayed seated. I turned to him, the man I had once rocked to sleep through fevered nights, the boy I fed when he wouldn't eat anything but oatmeal and banana. He looked back at me with hollow eyes. "I didn't know she was keeping the deposit," he said quietly. "I thought she asked you." I didn't know. I didn't flinch. "And yet, you never asked me." "Not once." He looked away. There was a pause, a long, aching silence between us, and then I asked softly, "Would you like some tea?" He didn't answer. I stood, walked to the cabinet, and took down 2 mugs anyway. One for him, one for me. Whether he stayed or not, that would be his choice. But everything else, that was already mine, always had been, and now they both knew it. They sat in my sunroom, the early light glinting off the glass table between us. My son shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Angela, on the other hand, looked like she'd rehearsed every word in front of a mirror. The man beside them, still in the same stiff black suit from their last visit, cleared his throat and pulled a folder from his briefcase. "We've prepared a mutually beneficial agreement, Mrs. Dawson," he said smoothly, sliding the document toward me. "It's a co-ownership arrangement. Your name stays, but legal rights extend to your son and daughter-in-law, effective immediately." I didn't even glance at the paperwork. Instead, I picked up my teacup and took a long sip, letting the silence stretch just enough to make them fidget. Angela broke first. "It's fair. You get to stay, and we get some peace of mind. We just want clarity moving forward." I smiled slightly. "Clarity is good. But let me make one thing clear to you, dear." I reached into the drawer behind me and pulled out an old envelope, yellowed but crisp. I placed it gently on top of their sleek packet. It was the original deed, dated, notarized, sealed. My husband's name was still on it, alongside mine. "I've never signed over anything to either of you," I said, voice calm but unmistakable. "This land, this house, it's all mine. And not just in paper, but in history. Every flower bed out there, your father planted it with his own hands. That shed out back, we built it together one summer when we couldn't afford a vacation." My voice softened, but my spine stayed straight. "This is the last place on earth that still smells like him." Angela's face twisted into something between anger and disbelief. I married him because I thought this came with the deal. I thought. She turned to my son. You said she wouldn't fight us on this. He looked ashamed, but not enough. Not nearly enough. I folded my hands neatly on my lap and met her glare with nothing but stillness. Your mistake, I said gently, was assuming love comes with a title deed. It doesn't, and neither does entitlement. The lawyer opened his mouth again, but I held up one hand, palm toward him. I'm not signing anything, I said, voice now steel beneath silk. And I don't owe anyone in this room an explanation for that. Angela stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the tile. This is ridiculous. What's ridiculous? I said evenly. Is thinking you can bully an old woman into handing over the only thing she has left of her husband. My son spoke for the first time. Mom, maybe we can talk about it again? Later? I looked at him carefully, looked at the boy I raised, the man who once brought me flowers on Mother's Day without fail, the son who used to build Lego castles on this very floor. And then I looked at the man he'd become. Silenced, complicit, hollow. No, I said. We won't talk about this later. Or ever again, Angela scoffed, snatching the folder back. We'll find other ways then. You're welcome to try, I said, standing slowly. But know this, every attempt to take what isn't yours only reveals more about who you are, not who I am. I walked to the door and opened it. You can see yourselves out, I added gently. They hesitated, but I didn't move. After a moment, they left. Angela stomping, the lawyer awkwardly nodding, my son glancing back once before following them. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I simply closed it behind them, quietly, then turned and walked back to my chair. I picked up my tea again, still warm. Outside, the roses were blooming, late for the season, but full and radiant. The light hit the petals just right, casting soft pink shadows against the wall. I took another sip and exhaled slowly. There's a certain kind of strength in saying no. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of love for yourself and the life you've built. They thought my silence meant weakness. But silence, when chosen, is the loudest kind of power. They wanted to own the house. But I had already owned the truth, and I wasn't giving that away for anything. A week after that dreadful visit from my son and his wife, with their lawyer in tow, I thought the storm had passed. I'd returned to my quiet routines, pruning the roses, walking down to the mailbox with my little straw hat, and making tea for one. I had no intention of speaking about what happened, not to my neighbors, not to my church group, not to the barista who used to greet me by name. But then, something unexpected happened. It started with a buzz on my phone. A message from Carla, the florist's daughter who used to ride her bike past my fence every summer. Hi, Mrs. D. I saw a post online. I hope you're okay. You didn't deserve any of that. I stared at the screen, confused. Post? Online? A few minutes later, another message arrived. We just found out what happened at the wedding. It's awful. Please know you have people who care curious and slightly anxious. I clicked the link she had sent. It was a Facebook post from one of the catering assistants, probably no older than 22, who had worked the wedding. A snapshot of the setup, followed by a caption that read, "This weekend, I worked a wedding at the most beautiful private garden estate I've ever seen." Everything was perfect. Except for one thing. The mother of the groom wasn't there, because she wasn't invited, even though it was her land. H-E-R land. I asked around. She had prepaid for everything, and then they kicked her out. She watched the wedding from inside her house. It broke my heart. There was no photo of me, no names, just the truth, plain and painful. And somehow that truth caught fire. The comments section exploded. Hundreds of strangers began sharing the post. Some wrote with indignation, others with disbelief, and many with sorrow. People asked, "Who was this woman?" Then someone answered, "That sounds like Mrs. Davenport. She used to teach 3rd grade. I remember her. She taught me how to write cursive." Another chimed in, "That's the woman who gave my mom a ride to her chemo appointments. She's an angel." I kept scrolling. She helped build the community library. She hosted garden tours to raise money for the animal shelter. Her husband was the local firefighter who died saving 3 kids. That's her suddenly. The silence I'd been living in shattered. Not in anger, not in noise, but in recognition, in warmth. My inbox overflowed. "I was your student in '89. You told me my poetry mattered. You gave me a pie once when my mom passed. I never forgot. You are not invisible." I wasn't prepared for the wave of kindness. I had braced for shame, for pity, for condescension. But what came was grace. 2 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was handwritten, no return address, just soft cursive and a wax seal. I opened it at the kitchen table, my fingers trembling slightly. "Dear Mrs. Davenport, we don't know you personally, but we read about what happened. My fiancé and I are both teachers, just starting out. We've been looking for a small, meaningful place to get married, something with heart. We don't have much, but we'd be honored to say our vows in your garden, if you'd let us. No guests, no fanfare, just us, a few sunflowers, and a promise to make our marriage nothing like what we've seen in that post. With admiration, Claire and Devin." My hand covered my mouth, and for the first time in weeks, I cried. Not from humiliation, not from betrayal, but from the feeling of being seen, of being known, not for my money, not for my land, but for the quiet things, the things that had always mattered. I sat in my garden that evening, the letter pressed to my chest, and whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Maybe the world had gone cold in places, but there were still sparks of warmth, still people who remembered, still young couples who wanted their future built on truth, not convenience. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't irrelevant. And I wasn't alone. Let them have their marble halls and Instagram backdrops. I had roses. I had kindness. And for the first time in a long while, I had hope. I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. And a little hollow. Grief, when it settles, doesn't come with fire. It comes with stillness. Like a fog that drifts in and stays. Not violent, just quietly present. I had spent weeks replaying things in my mind, trying to find the moment where I could have stopped the unraveling. But sometimes, truthfully, there is no such moment. Sometimes people walk themselves into who they want to be, and they don't look back. So I wrote a letter. Not to demand an apology. Not to explain myself. Not even to open the door again. I wrote it because there were words in my chest that had nowhere else to go, and I didn't want them to rot in me. "Dear son," I began, "I am not angry with you. I want you to know that first. I am not writing this out of bitterness. I am not trying to shame you or even to change your mind. I'm writing this because I love you, but also because I finally love myself enough to say goodbye the right way." I paused, pen resting against the notepad. I could still see his 6-year-old self, crouched by the pond behind the barn, holding a frog like it was a piece of gold. That boy with dirt on his knees and sun on his shoulders. He hadn't meant to become the man who looked through me like glass. But life has a way of turning if you're not careful. And people grow around the wrong things. I kept writing. I raised you the best I could. I gave you everything I had. My time, my strength, even things I didn't know I possessed until they were already gone. I stood behind you in silence when you needed the spotlight. I sold heirlooms to cover your dreams. I stayed quiet when you forgot my birthday, my anniversary, my name in the middle of a speech. I let myself become background. Not because I didn't have a voice, but because I wanted you to shine. But somewhere along the way, you mistook my silence for insignificance. You forgot I existed outside of what I could give. I folded the page gently, then opened another. I'm not asking for anything, not your remorse, not your attention, not even your understanding. I'm writing this because I need to close the door from my side. That is what this is. Not a punishment, just a boundary, a quiet one. You said I didn't belong at your wedding, that it was better for the vibe if I stayed away. You said it so casually. And I wonder now if you even heard yourself. If you knew what it meant to tell your mother she was inconvenient. But I want you to know this. I didn't stay away out of obedience. I stayed away because I chose not to fight for a seat in a place where I was unwelcome. I stayed away because dignity, once threatened, needs distance to heal. A tear rolled down, but I didn't brush it off. I let it fall. I opened my photo box and searched for the one I knew I still kept. Him at 3 years old in overalls, arms around my neck, laughing so hard his eyes were barely open. I slipped it into the envelope with the letter. No demands, no lecture, just memory. On the back of the photo, I wrote, "We were happy once." I hope you remember I sealed the envelope, wrote his name with a tenderness I didn't expect would still live in my fingers, and left it by the mailbox. No return address, no signature on the back, just a message carried by time. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in weeks. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. Letting go, I realized, wasn't a moment. It was a practice. A soft decision made daily. To not reopen old wounds. To not wait by a phone. To not defend your worth to people who need reminding. I didn't know if he'd read it. I didn't know if he'd care. But I knew I had spoken. Gently. Firmly. Finally. And that was enough. I was in the garden when it happened. The late afternoon sun had softened, casting a golden hue over the rose bushes I'd been tending. The soil was still warm from the day, and my hands were gently coaxing new buds from a bush I had planted in early spring. I didn't hear his footsteps at first, only noticed a faint shadow fall across the garden path. I stood slowly, brushing the earth off my palms, and turned to see a man, perhaps in his 50s, standing just outside the picket fence. His hair was peppered with gray, and his eyes held that cautious warmth you see in someone who isn't sure if they're intruding. He tipped his hat slightly. "Pardon me. Are you Mrs. Darla Whitmore?" I nodded, a bit wary but curious. "Yes, I am." He smiled gently. "I'm David Lawson. My mother was Eleanor Lawson. She used to be close friends with your husband, Paul. They went way back. She always spoke fondly of you both." At the sound of Eleanor's name, something in me softened. I hadn't heard that name in years. Paul had mentioned her often. She was the kind of friend who knew your story without needing to ask. I stepped closer to the fence. "She used to visit here when I was young," he added. "Told me you made the best blueberry pie in all of Charleston." I chuckled. I haven't made one in years, but I'd argue she wasn't wrong. That made him laugh. A quiet, unhurried kind of laugh. The kind that doesn't need to impress. "I was in the area," he continued, "and I just felt like I should stop by. I've been reading some things online about the wedding, about what happened here. It didn't sit right with me. I blinked, so he knew. He didn't gawk or ask insensitive questions. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch gently between us like a hammock in the wind. Eventually, I opened the gate. "Would you like some tea?" I asked. "The kind Eleanor used to like, Earl Grey with lemon." He followed me to the back porch, and we sat at the small table I'd spent most of my mornings at these past few weeks. There was something strangely comforting about his presence. Not familiar, but not foreign either. Like someone who knew the landscape of grief and tenderness well enough to navigate it respectfully. We talked, for hours, about Eleanor, about Paul, about how quickly time moves and how slowly wounds heal. He told me he'd lost his wife 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. "Quick and cruel," he said softly, eyes fixed on the rim of his cup. "One day we were planting daffodils. The next, I was holding her hand in a cold hospital room." I didn't say anything, just reached over and laid my hand gently over his. A small act, but it felt enough. He looked up and smiled, not because it was funny, but because sometimes kindness makes people feel shy. "I never had children," he continued. "Always wanted to, but life didn't line up that way. And now, I don't know. I suppose I've got time, but not the same kind of hope." There was a shared ache in the air, but it didn't weigh us down. Instead, it felt like an understanding. Two people who had watched their roles in life change too suddenly and were learning how to exist beyond the roles they once held. When the sky began to dim and the scent of blooming roses wrapped itself around the porch, he stood to leave. "I'm glad I came," he said, pausing before stepping off the porch. "And I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but I have a small plot of land just over the hill near Deerfield Ridge. It's nothing fancy, but the soil's rich. Gets plenty of sun. I've always thought it'd be a waste to let it sit empty." I raised an eyebrow. He smiled. "If you ever feel like planting more roses, or just sitting under a willow tree with a book, I'd be honored to share it." I didn't know what to say at first. I hadn't expected this kind of offer. Not today, not ever. But then I felt something. Not a jolt, not fireworks, just a settling. Like a stone finding the bottom of a still pond. Peaceful, uncomplicated. So I smiled back and said simply, "Thank you, David. That's very kind." He tipped his hat again and began walking down the gravel path. The wind picked up just slightly, stirring the rose petals beside me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own story. Not a burden. Not a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's life. Just a woman. With a name. With hands that still loved the earth. With eyes that could still see something beautiful blooming on the other side of loss. And that, I realized, was enough. I wasn't in any of the wedding photos. Not a single frame. When I stumbled upon the online album weeks later, it was filled with carefully curated moments. Laughing guests, flowing champagne, picture-perfect sunsets. But there was no trace of me. Not even in the background. It was as if I had never existed in their story. But strangely, I didn't feel hurt this time. I had my own photos, Photos of me with my rose bushes in full bloom, of me sipping tea with morning light spilling through the kitchen window, of me kneeling in the dirt, hands covered in soil, planting new lavender around the porch. I didn't need to be part of their glossy narrative anymore. My life wasn't something to be cropped out. It just didn't need their frame to feel whole. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that once made me feel invisible. Now it felt sacred. There were no slamming doors, no footsteps pacing in resentment, no raised voices echoing down the hall. Just the soft rustle of trees outside my window, the occasional creak of the old floorboards, and the steady rhythm of my breath. The emptiness had changed. It no longer felt like a hollow reminder of everything I had lost. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to remember who I was before being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's caretaker. I had spent decades as a background figure in other people's stories. Now, I was reclaiming my own. And slowly, quietly, people began to find their way to me, not out of obligation, but out of something purer. The first to return were the neighbors. They started stopping by more often, not just to check in, but to linger. Mrs. Hall brought over homemade peach cobbler. Her grandson helped me fix the squeaky gate. A girl from the bookstore left a note in my mailbox. You always smiled at me when I was too shy to speak. I never forgot that then came the young couple, the ones who had written the handwritten letter. They visited with wide eyes and soft voices, walking through my garden like it was a sacred space. They asked if they could still have their wedding here. Just the two of them, some close friends, and a violinist. No extravagant gowns, no elaborate catering. Just love, honesty, and a tree draped with fairy lights. I said yes. Of course I did. That small wedding changed something in me. Watching them exchange vows under the old elm tree, right where my son had once built forts as a boy, felt like a quiet kind of redemption. It was as though that patch of land had been scrubbed clean of ego and expectation. Love returned to it. Gentle, unselfish love. It inspired me. A week later, I hosted a small gathering of my own. No occasion, no announcements. Just a celebration of presence. I invited neighbors, old friends from the school where I used to teach. Even some of the students who had reached out after that Facebook post went viral. The couple I'd hosted was there too, holding hands, glowing with that particular shine that only newlyweds have. We drank lemonade, shared stories, laughed, not the polite kind, but the loud, open-mouthed kind that shakes the sadness off your bones. At one point, someone pulled out an old photo album I hadn't seen in years. There I was, 28, in a denim dress, holding a tiny baby boy who would one day forget how I held him like the world depended on it. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't longing to be part of someone else's picture. I wasn't waiting for a seat at someone else's table or an invitation to be seen. I was here. I was enough. In full view, not edited out, not fading at the edges. No one at that party asked me to leave early. No one looked past me or spoke over me. No one expected me to shrink to make space for someone else. And most importantly, no one tried to silence my story. I was not a burden that day, not a placeholder, not a fading memory. I was the host. I lit the candles. I arranged the flowers. I poured the wine and cut the cake and hugged everyone as they left. And when the last guest waved goodbye and the house fell silent again, I sat on the porch, wrapped in my favorite shawl, and watched the stars come out. I didn't need to be invited into any frame anymore. This, this moment, this life, this breath was already mine.